Us. Hello, everybody.
All right. Shall we get started? Are we on, Yazid? All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hani Shennib. I am the founding president of the National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations. And we are here today to address a very important topic. Everyone in Libya is looking forward to an election. Everyone in Libya is looking at an election that is supposed to happen on December 24th. This election has been made as a decision by the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, who met several times in several places under the guidance of the United Nations mission in Libya, with the support of the Berlin 1 and Berlin 2 group that expressed strong support for moving forwards towards this election. For many reasons, the country has been quite unstable for the last 10 years. There are differences. There had been a horrible war on the capital, Tripoli. Ended with a truce and negotiations that started thereafter, with the 5+5 group agreeing on an agenda. And that agenda, as far as we are concerned, has not happened yet for many reasons. Again, the political process has been stalled by disagreement. There was supposed to be a consensus built at the last Geneva meeting, and unfortunately, the news that came out from there has not been very positive. So with this introduction, and also with the sense that the United States particularly is advocating and pushing for a commitment to the December 24th elections, it would be very interesting from the U.S. perspective to see whether U.S. policy is in the right direction vis-a-vis this day and the day after, and what may happen after the elections. So I have with me today some very distinguished Libyan experts, we are very fortunate, particularly, to have two of the members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, two activist lawyers from Libya, who have participated in the legal committees in Geneva, and very good insight on the process and what happened. I'm going to start this dialogue with 4 minutes maximum conversation and comment made by the participants, and then we will open the forum for a discussion. Our first participant is Zahra Langhi. Again, Zahra is very well known in her activism as the head of the Women for Peace platform. She had participated in almost every session of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. And Zahra Langhi, do you mind giving us a 4 minutes introduction as to the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, how very quickly it was initiated, its participants, and the progress that has happened from day one up until Geneva 10 days ago? Zahra, welcome.
Oh. Thank you, Dr. Hani. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. I will start right ahead. The last week meeting, actually, we reached a stalemate, like anything else in Libya. There's no consensus so far on the constitutional rule as was plan to that we all reach a consensus by the 1st of July. to meet the deadline that was put by the Electoral Commission and the Security Council. Hence, now the head of the Electoral Commission has proposed another deadline, which is the 1st of August. Unfortunately, things doesn't look really well. And since this is only 4 minutes intervention, so I would go ahead and maybe we were looking forward to have to ensure inclusive constitutional rule and electoral legislations, especially the constitutional rule that was supposed to be agreed by the LPDF and supposedly adopted by the HOR on time. However, that was not reached. That means now we would maybe consider looking into other options and alternatives, because everything in Libya reaches a stalemate. So I think the LPDF is becoming more like the other institutions that we have, the HOR and the State Council. So what happened is basically we had 2 months ago, we agreed on a draft on the constitutional basis, which does not, which had clear criteria and prerequisites for running. That did not allow for any military members of the military to run before resigning. That became an issue later on from those representing the LNA. Another issue was in the conditions that those who were indicted for committing crimes against humanity and war crimes, that was also not liked by those representing Saif al-Gaddafi. So that was removed. The week before we had the meeting, the LPDF, suddenly out of the blues, the committee of the advisory committee was convened again. And came out with a proposal, which some of us thought that it was not in its mandate, so it was problematic. That proposal that came on the day, that allowed for members of for very loose criteria to run, basically, made the whole process, the electoral process, especially the presidential electoral process, controversial. In that meeting, everything, as I said, Pandora's box was unleashed. There was breach of the mandate of the UN, of the roadmap. There were proposals. Everything was in chaos in that meeting last week in Geneva. So it was not a surprise that we would not reach anything. I think there was clearly a lack of UN leadership in that meeting. UN ONSML was not acting as a mediator, but rather they kept on saying we're a facilitator. They allowed for all kinds of proposals to come, and actually the US were clear in their position, renouncing what happened last week in LPDF. As they said, there were proposals which were basically poisonous pills. So the referendum was on the table again. Discussing the date of the elections was on the table of negotiation. Everything was in complete chaos. That's why, especially for the women's bloc, we acted as more like spoiling the efforts of spoilers. Now, I think the interesting proposal is the one that came out from Al-Kuni, the deputy head of the Presidential Council, that they would issue a decree by force of a law adopting a constitutional basis. The HOR is also working at the moment on electoral legislations. That might be more divisive because they're still a part of the scene. So it's not clear whether the LPDF would be convening again. They talk about the consensus committee. Everything is not clear at the moment. Everything is divisive. Lack of leadership on part of UNSMIL. That's why I think we have to stick to the roadmap, but not necessarily the vehicle that would present the constitutional rule. So I would say that something like the alternative proposed by the Presidential Council will eventually might save the day, because we have to stick to the date of 24th of December, and we have to ensure that it is inclusive enough, and that the concerns that people have that the army may not run committing indictments, these are the conditions that should be in any constitutional rule. But it doesn't matter who proposes the constitutional rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. I'd like to have Amal step in and put in her retrospect as well as prospect of what had happened at the last Geneva meeting. And does she agree, Zahra? What is her reflection as to where we are going from here? Is this salvageable, number one? And number two is, are we moving in the right direction? And if not, what does it take to get back on track again with all the spoilers that are there, as well as the constitutional debates? Amal, please, for your opinion on this.
نعم، مساء الخير. أنا سأتحدث العربية لأنني لا أجيد الإنجليزية بشكل جيد. بالنسبة لما يحدث الآن تجتمع لجنة التوافقات، وهي لجنة مصغرة أنشأتها الأمم المتحدة. كل عضو فيها تحصل على 5 تزكيات من أعضاء الملتقى، واليوم تجتمع هذه اللجنة، بدأت في اجتماعاتها عبر الزوم من أجل التوافق على حل للانسداد الذي حصل. المعركة الحقيقية هي بين مشروعين: مشروع يذهب إلى العمل بالقاعدة القانونية التي وضعها الملتقى، التي وضعتها اللجنة القانونية بالملتقى، وهي القاعدة القانونية التي عملنا عليها عدة أشهر مع الزملاء من 18 عضو، وانتهينا إلى إقرارها بالإجماع. والصراع هو بين العمل بها وبين مشروع آخر، يعني تم إلغاء جميع المشاريع وأصبح مشروع آخر منافس، وهو العمل بتأجيل الانتخابات. تأجيل يعني ليس تأجيل الانتخابات في الواقع، ولكن إجراء الاستفتاء على الدستور أولاً. طبعاً إجراء الاستفتاء على الدستور أولاً، هذا معناه الواضح هو تأجيل انتخابات 24 ديسمبر، لأنه ليس من المعقول أننا سنجري الاستفتاء على الدستور. أولاً حسب ما يطرحونهم سيتم تعديل هذا الدستور عبر لجنة مختصة من 5 أفراد من كل إقليم، هي لجنة ال15، ستتولى تعديل النقاط الخلافية في مسودة الدستور الحالية الموجودة اللي كانت مثار خلافات كبيرة، اللي هي بتاعت 2017. وبعد أن يتم تعديلها يتم إجراء الاستفتاء عليها، وإذا ظهرت نتيجة الاستفتاء بلا، بمعنى إذا رفضها الناس، سيتم اعتبارها قاعدة دستورية للانتخابات القادمة. وهذا يعني شيء غريب جدا أن يقال أن سنجري الاستفتاء على هذه المسودة، وإذا تم رفضها سنجبر الناس على قبولها كقاعدة دستورية للانتخابات القادمة. أيضا أن كل هذا العمل سينتهي في ليبيا خلال 6 أشهر هو قول يعني يتم الضحك به على الذقون، لأن لا يمكن لنا في ليبيا أن نجري تعديل لمسودة الدستور، وهذا يقتضي توافقات كبيرة على النقاط الخلافية، ثم بعد ذلك نجري الاستفتاء وتظهر نتيجة الاستفتاء ونستعد للانتخابات ونقوم بها بناء على هذه المسودة سواء قبلناها أو رفضناها، وذلك هذا كل العمل هذا يتم خلال 6 أشهر. فالحقيقة التي وراء هذا المشروع هو تعطيل الانتخابات وعدم القيام بها في الموعد المحدد لها. هذا الآن هو حقيقة الصراع. حقيقة الصراع أن الجماعة الذين اتفقنا معهم خلال الملتقى وخلال القاعدة القانونية على مشروع محدد واحد، وهو القاعدة القانونية التي وضعنا بها المادة الأولى، النص الذي يقول يؤجل الاستفتاء على الدستور إلى السلطة النيابية القادمة الجديدة، السلطة التشريعية القادمة هي التي ستقوم بتعديل الدستور عبر لجنة، هي أيضا لجنة من 15 شخص تقوم بتعديل هذا المشروع، والانتخابات الجديدة التي هي ستقوم بعد 4 سنوات أخرى هي التي ستقام على الدستور الدائم الذي يتم تعديله والاستفتاء عليه خلال المدة القادمة، يعني خلال 4 سنوات، وهذا الكلام منطقي ويتناسب مع الواقع الليبي. هذه هي حقيقة الصراع. اليوم بدأت لجنة التوافقات. أنا أتوقع أن الذي سيفوز هو القاعدة القانونية التي وضعها الملتقى، لأن هذا الطرح الجديد لم يكن ضمن منهجية العمل التي نصت عليها خارطة الطريق. خارطة الطريق لم تسمح بمشاريع أخرى، كان هناك وقت محدد لتقديم مشاريع لقاعدة قانونية، وبعد انتهاء هذا الوقت قمنا نحن اللجنة القانونية ببلورة هذه المشاريع كلها في مشروع واحد، وهذا هو الذي يجب أن يتم العمل عليه. وبعد أن تم تقديمه تم إغلاق الباب أمام أي مشاريع أخرى. هذا ما اتفقنا عليه في الأمم المتحدة، ولكن المعيب أن الأمم المتحدة لم تلتزم بمنهجية العمل التي اتفقنا عليها. أن زملائنا في اللجنة القانونية الذين صاغوا النص الخاص، يعني أنا أتذكر جيدا أنه بالاجتماع الأخير بتونس كان هناك صراع كبير على هل الاستفتاء أولا أم الانتخابات أولا، وانتهينا إلى اتفاق بالإجماع إلى تأجيل الاستفتاء. وزملاؤنا الذين كتبوا هذا النص بأنفسهم، أذكر أن سيد عمر بوليفة كان معنا وهو الذي كتب النص بنفسه، ووافقنا على صياغته كما أرادها، وكانت هذه هي المادة الأولى في القاعدة الدستورية التي وضعتها اللجنة القانونية. فوجئنا بالانقلاب بالنقوص عن الاتفاق الذي تم.
أمال، طبعا أحتاج أن نعمل الترجمة بتاع حضرتك، فأعطيني بس يعني.
Okay.
So Amal, who is a member in the legal committee of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, has kind of briefed us on what happened again, just as Zahra did, discussed the fact that there were some agreements done on the initial meetings of the Libyan Political Dialogue, and the decisions were made at that time, at the first meeting, that the issue of the there's a lot of ways, so maybe can mute a little bit. So the decision was made was to postpone the discussions on the constitutional debate and the choice of the constitution until the elections of members of parliaments after the elections. What was found later on at the meetings, particularly the ones in Geneva, was that the United Nations representative had opened the forum intentionally or unintentionally for a discussion of the matter of the Constitution, and there was a significant component of the other side of the debate who insisted on having constitutional referendum before or at the same time of going into the election in December of 24th. This has kind of opened up Pandora's box. It disrupted the discussions and has put a halt on the progress of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum and the movement towards the elections on the chosen date. Leila describes that practically it is impossible to have a committee of 15, 5 from each province, get together, make amendments to the constitution, and then forward a constitution for a referendum within a time frame between now and December 24th. It's practically impossible from her experience, from the experience of how things are done in Libya. So in essence, this type of proposal would basically lead to postponement indefinitely of the December 24th elections, which can actually create some really serious delay and halt in the progress of the whole country's stability and may actually result in further worsening of the conditions over there. So I hope I actually summarized it reasonably, Leila. I'm sure I'm not as good as you in the details of the legal aspect, but thank you for sharing this with us. In essence, from Leila's opinion, that there is a very serious breach in the first agreement that was held. Everybody walked out of the original meetings, recognizing that this is the path that will be taken, but what has happened was contrary to this in the last Geneva meeting. There are currently, in the next few days, a committee that is looking into this matter and hoping that will exercise some correctional forces that will lead to going back to the original understanding of how the process should go on and the elections in December 24th. I'm going to invite Anas El Gomati. He is a very outspoken and eloquent writer, has written extensively on the situation in Libya. He is the founder and director of the Sadiq Institute. And Anas, I'd like to get your opinion on all these things that are happening in Libya and where we are going with the political process and whether the December 24th is feasible or not in the current circumstances. Anas?
Thank you, Hani. Thanks again for the kind invitation and for the space to speak about this afternoon. It's a really good question. I think we need to establish the broader context. And I think the broader context is that this was all brought around by the Berlin process. Berlin process that took place in January 2020, and then subsequently the second Berlin meeting. And I think that is a good way of kind of framing and starting to paint this picture of the context. Now, the context for Berlin 1 and the Berlin process, more broadly speaking, is that it's supposed to be a state-building process. The state-building process has been the segregation or the separation of 3 distinct tracks: the political track, the economic track, and the military track. And we've seen now some progress at the political track. We've seen some progress at the economic track. And we've seen some small progress at the military track. But they're all going in different directions, some that are going faster than others. And I think it's about sequence as well as substance when speaking about this specific issue, to try to understand why we need elections. Now, we should certainly affirm why we need elections in Libya and why there is so many individuals and constituents and so many groups today, and why there is a broad consensus why Libya should move forward to elections. And the first is that there is a desire, broadly speaking, to overhaul the political status quo. We've heard that term before. The need now to establish, an overhaul of actors that have been around in some cases for the last several years or 7 years. In many instances, actually, in this case, since March of this year. There is a desire to put the conflict behind us. I mean, there is multiple at the local level. There are people that are just fed up of the conflict and don't want to see a return of this, and that want to see finally the elections produce a democratic outcome. And I think by all 3 of those measures, I don't believe today that just calling for elections on their own on the 24th of December will result in a democratic outcome. And I think that's why there is, perhaps some greed from status quo actors, but there is certainly grievance and there is trepidation and hesitancy, because it looks like, in some respects, a thief in the night. Essentially, we've seen this film before, how institutions, individuals, constituencies, and groups, will try to come through the back door of elections. And I think that's where some of this aspect, particularly when we come to the substance of the conflict, is really why there is so much trepidation. Now, what I mean by that is, calling for elections in a fractured state with the idea that it will produce a democratic outcome, that it will result in the overhaul of those status quo actors, and finally that it will put the conflict behind us. On all three levels, I think there is well-placed grievance for that. The first aspect is that by calling for the overhaul of status quo actors, there will be a replacement of the parliament, there would be a replacement of the presidency, and there will be a replacement of the High State Council, the advisory body from the former parliament. But it doesn't mean that all of the institutions that are currently in play will be overhauled. That ranges from potentially the National Oil Corporation, the central bank, to other institutions in the Libyan Sovereign Wealth Fund that have been argued over and contested and competed over since even 2011, or even prior, if you want to argue that. But then going forward, at the military level, what has determined the conflict is really a key question about how these institutions, the military institutions, the networks of armed groups on the ground and militia on the ground in both the East, West, and the South, how they will react to democratic elections. And I think chief amongst that, and the elephant in the room today, is most likely Khalifa Haftar. I heard Zahra and Amal's comments, and I think they certainly have the view from inside the LPDF, and it's certainly an accurate view and one that I would echo. I don't believe that it is the only scenario on the table today. And I think the scenario that the LNA seek to run exclusively, can you speak louder? Yeah, I can try and speak a bit louder. I don't want to shout. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, sure.
Okay, so
sure.
I don't believe that today that we can kind of say that there is one conflict taking place in Libya. There are multiple layers of conflicts. There are different conflicts playing out at different times. Now, to some degree, the status quo that we speak of today, particularly in the LPDF, are between new actors. I mean, the status quo is as of March of 2021. The GNU perhaps has a vested interest in remaining in power for another 18 months or another 6 months, or depending on how one wants to see this, but it's not the source of the conflict. If we go back to the last UN process in 2015, there was a similar process that resulted in some quasi-state building process, a new presidential council, a new government of national accord, not unity. And there was a forcing through of a new conversation between the LNA and the GNA. And that lasted for several years. It was the plan B scenario that was put on the table, essentially, to negotiate over Article 8, which is the subservience of the military and its armed services to an elected or an appointed civilian head. That is certainly the major conflict that I see today, and it's one that has been playing out over the last several years. Kicking that conversation down the road and coming through the back door, because you don't get to vote for your military. You get to vote for a parliament, you get to vote for a new president, but you don't get to negotiate or vote or select who your military will be. And I think kicking that conversation down the road is a danger, a clear danger for many of those that are certainly looking at the second and the third aspect of what we're trying to seek through elections, namely a democratic process and outcome, but more importantly, an end of the conflict. I think on both sides of this, there is no consensus. There are individuals and constituencies and groups who feel that the LNA is a legitimate army. There are those on the other side of the aisle that believe that that is more akin to the Jamahiriya and that it's an authoritarian structure. And I think that we have to be able to figure out and forge consensus without a winner-takes-all scenario. And that's why I also think that presidential elections in a winner-take-all model might not be the best outcome. I don't think it would be a peaceful outcome, given that it's such a dangerous binary. So I also think that this takes us back to the overall context. I wouldn't want to present this as a binary conflict between status quo politicians that emerged in March and all of those against them as being in favor of democracy. And I think today we find Khalifa Haftar is in favor of democracy because he might believe that it produces a favorable outcome for him. I don't believe that is the case in its entirety. And I don't believe that his only plan is to stand for presidency. He certainly wants to stand as the head of the military, irrespective of what outcome happens, whether he's the president, whether he fails, or whether one of his proxies stands. I think that is a dangerous conversation that we have ignored for far too long. And it's certainly one that really comes back to the heart of this conversation, that if you do not complete the state building process by the time you call for elections, you're kicking down the majority of this conflict to the next parliament. The next parliament will have to, and next presidency will have to negotiate this. And I think that's a very dangerous negotiation because it's an incredibly competitive process, a very, very strict binary. It's a win or lose scenario for those that are looking at particular candidates. And I think it also plays into the broader context of the international arena. There are actors that still want to provide diplomatic veto for Khalifa Haftar, whether it be Russia and France at the UN Security Council level, but also France at the EU level. And there are regional actors that are willing to fund him, like the United Arab Emirates. And I think that has not been solved. Russia's own military presence in central Libya, which is not just a mercenary presence, but going back to July of 2019, 2 of their operatives were apprehended and put into prison in Tripoli, not because they were fighting on the front lines, but because they were accused of election meddling. And I think that's also something that calls into question whether or not there are conditions in Libya for free and fair elections, starting at whether or not you have the Wagner Group meddling in elections, or whether or not you can actually have, you know, safe ballots and safe booths in which to produce and dip your fingers in ink. I don't know whether that is the case today, whether it's in East or West Libya. So I think this dangerous question of ignoring both the militia and military structures, whether we call them militia in the East or West or the South, is I think is semantics at this point. I don't believe that they can actually be, they're not responsible custodians to allow for free and fair elections. Kicking down the conflict in the way that we've seen this in the last several years is no way to end the conflict. And I think elections might actually ripen more conflict. And I think that's where it comes to this final aspect of, you know, really producing a democratic outcome. So I think we have to call those questions in, understand whether or not it's greed or grievance at play, but certainly not dismiss them entirely. So that's where I think the trepidation and the hesitation comes from in certain quarters. Thanks, Hani.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your brief, Anas. You try to summarize a very complex situation. And one gets the sense from what you just said is that it's almost like a mission impossible to do something that is workable by December 24th and deal with the nightmare after that. But we will get back to this very soon. Since you've brought in past experience with elections, I'd like to invite Wolfgang Pusztai to share with us, if you don't mind, Wolfgang, in a very few minutes, your thoughts on past experience with elections, particularly elections of 2014, and if you could project some of those experiences on what is happening now. And also, if you can indwell a little bit on the security component of the truce that is existing right now with 5+5. Wolfgang? Wolfgang, are you with us?
Yes, I'm back. Actually, I need to switch my phone in a couple of minutes, but it should be sufficient for my intro statement. I would say, for the time being, there is no better solution for Libya for the way ahead than to have elections. Taking into account everything what Anas said, and he has several very good points, I believe that it is necessary for Libya to have a more democratic legitimated government and a more democratically legitimated parliament. And this can be only achieved through elections. But if we look back to the year 2012 and 2014, this is extremely difficult to achieve. And there are several parallels. For example, the Constitutional Declaration of 2011, which was very positive in itself, set an entirely unrealistic timetable for the transition phase. And one needs to ask, how realistic is it to have a referendum about the draft constitution before the December elections, as demanded by some? We had the first free elections in July 2012, which were euphorically celebrated by the international community. We all know the outcome. And we all know right now that just about 44% of those eligible to vote per se really voted. And we know that the voter turnout was relatively high in the capital, but minimal in other remote areas. So I would say it's important not to exaggerate successes euphorically if they are in fact moderate. And this is a problem we see in Libya since years. 2 years later, only about 14.6%, 630,000 people participated in the parliamentary elections. And we know that this was one of the triggers of Libya's civil war. The smaller the participation in elections is, the more likely and easier it is to reject the results for those who are against the outcome. And I'm here with Anas. In October 2014, there was a controversial Supreme Court decision ruling the elections unconstitutional and adding to the already heated situation. So I would strongly argue that there is a broad consensus necessary about the constitutional basis for elections. Otherwise, it will be difficult to get the outcome, the results recognized. While only about 1.5 million people were registered for the first round of local elections in 2013-15, the turnout was about 58%, so quite amazing for Libya. For the second round,
you come closer to the microphone, please. We're not hearing you very clearly. No, we lost you completely now. We lost you. We lost you completely, Wolfgang. Yeah. Wolfgang,
you're on.
We can't. Wolfgang.
Unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself, Wolfgang. Wolfgang. All right. Well, I'll get back. Wolfgang, if you can't hear us and we can't hear you, we'll get back to you in a few minutes. I would like to invite Mohamed Eljarh to make a comment on the process and where we are at this point, and whether, in your opinion, Mohamed, the right way to go through it, and whether it is a process that should be supported within its current appearance and content. Mohamed?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hani. I hope you can all hear me clearly. I thank you for the invitation to be with you today. I will start with very quick points. I think the complexities that we are witnessing today were expected. This is what happens when you choose expediency over integrity of the process. And we are witnessing the results of expediency with a UN-led process, the lack of vetting, corruption allegations, and so on and so forth. But everyone turned a blind eye and they just thought they can continue to progress. So a lot of what's happening now, people have warned about in the back. The other issue is something that Zahra highlighted, which is the issue of change of UN leadership at a very critical time. Stephanie Williams and Ghassan Salama basically designed and cooked up this process, if you like. And then we have two new people coming in, Zaninga and Jan Kubish, who don't appear to be so committed to the implementation of this political roadmap that was agreed in Tunis last year. And unless there is a change of course by UN leadership to show that they are truly committed to the implementation of the provisions of the political roadmap, I think this whole process will continue to unravel and will eventually collapse, and we will not have elections on the 24th of December, and Libya will be plunged into yet another legitimacy crisis. Some of the things that the UN leadership can do is to ensure adherence to UN Security Council resolutions 2570 and 2571. They can ensure that if necessary, and it is necessary in my view, there is reform within the LPDF. There are certain members who have taken up roles with the government. There are certain members who have been appointed to the LPDF through Aguila Saleh or through certain stakeholders, and they no longer represent the sides that have appointed them. Some of these members have now become problematic. In Geneva, they played a problematic role and a spoiling role. And I think unless UNSMIL takes a very hard approach to spoiling within the process, it will be difficult to get the process back on track. And we will miss the deadline of the 1st of July, like we missed the deadline of the 1st of August, like we did with the 1st of July. And we will miss the 24th of December deadline. Now, the dilemma is as follows with the elections. We can all agree that the time frame for holding elections in Libya was too small. It's too small of a window to hold elections on the 24th of December. But it has been agreed. It has been agreed. It is part of an agreement by which we now have a unified government. So if there is any stepping back on any of the provisions of that political agreement, then who could stop Khalifa Haftar or Aguila Saleh or anyone else from questioning all the provisions of that agreement? So if we say, well, we're not going to meet the provision for holding elections 21 December, people will say, well, we do not recognize this government then anymore. And then we will, and it's very likely that we will go in that direction again, unless we witness some change, of course, by the UN leadership, the international community, and also by Libyan stakeholders. Now, on a point that Anas mentioned, which I think is very important, elections in Libya are not about creating a democratic system or establishing democracy. It was naive to believe that the 2012 elections were going to produce democracy in Libya, and it is naive to believe that the elections the 24th of December will produce democracy in Libya. The elections are to answer one question: who leads Libya for this period? Who do the Libyan people want to choose through the ballot box to choose as a president or in the parliament to lead the country through this turbulent time, like they did in 2012, like they did in 2014, and the results are likely to be mixed. Anas is right in warning that it could trigger a conflict indeed, and unfortunately, the status quo forces, that is the government, the House of Representatives, State Council, Khalifa Haftar and the LNA, etc., instead of working hard to prepare the environment, the minimum threshold of conditions for elections to take place on the 24th of December, instead they are stalling. They are coming up with all these different arguments for why elections should not happen. Now, the question that we should be asking is, what is the way forward? Should it be elections, which I believe should be the way, that Libyans should freely choose their leaders through the ballot box? And that by no means means that we will establish democracy on the 24th of December. The other way is to say that we have backroom deals between Haftar and Aguila, Haftar and Dbeiba, for example. And indeed, they are talking to each other. They are negotiating. They have been negotiating in Geneva and in Tunis. They're trying to reach a deal, cook a deal between them by which Haftar gets what he wants in terms of budget and concessions from Dbeiba on appointments to the Minister of Defense and other matters. And Dbeiba remains in power beyond the 24th of December. This is being considered. The other way to do this is power sharing. To just say that elections don't work in Libya, we cannot have elections for reasons 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, which are the same reasons that existed, by the way, in 2012 and 2014. It didn't stop the elections from going ahead then. These are very important questions to ask regarding the current period. And then there are two very important issues, and maybe Wolfgang will expand on these very quickly. We have heard out of Berlin too that Turkey and Russia are close to reaching a deal for partial withdrawal of forces from Libya. And then we heard about a French proposal also on the issue of withdrawal. I think the issue of foreign forces in Libya is the main file that foreign actors involved in Libya are focused on. I don't think that the United States is as committed as the State Department says they are to elections on 24th of December. They are willing to forego of that. I think the Brits already are suggesting that we should either have partial elections or maybe we should indeed extend that BEIBA mandate beyond the 24th of December, as long as they get some sort of an agreement on Russia getting out or on the Turks getting out. I think the issue of foreign forces and mercenaries is becoming center stage, and I think the elections is being traded, if you like, for the withdrawal of foreign forces in Libya and the dividing of spoils.
Excellent points that you have made, and we will get back to this as we go on with the discussion. I'm going to get back to Wolfgang. I hope your voice box is cleared and that you're going to be able to speak clearly. Wolfgang?
Yes. Do you understand me better right now?
Much better. That's very good.
I needed to change my device as the battery was running out. I was talking about the problem of the voter turnout. And I've mentioned that the voter turnout during the first elections of the local elections in 2013 to 2015 was quite impressive, with 58%. Right now, for the second round, the average turnout is just 22%. And what strikes me even more is that currently there are less than 2.4 million Libyans registered for the December elections. This means only about 48 of those in the voting age. Just about 12,500 signed up last week. This is next to nothing. Registration ends in less than 3 weeks. If the voter turnout in the next elections is again just slightly more than 20%, as it is with the local elections, this would mean that just about 500,000 Libyans would vote. I doubt that 500,000 Libyans could give credibility to any future parliament or government or president. According to many public statements and polling, the vast majority of the Libyans wants to have general elections as soon as possible. But one could ask, how much interest do the Libyans really have to decide themselves about their destiny, if only a few are registering and even less people are going to vote? In several cities, the local elections must be repeated. And this brings me to security because of obvious election frauds. In some cases, honest citizens who informed the police in confidence about irregularities were threatened along with their families. Several of them had withdrawn their reports. None of the previous elections had a proper, safe and secure environment. None of them was properly monitored by international observers, also for security reasons. But a credible provision of security and a credible international monitoring is required to motivate more people to vote and to limit election fraud. I would say, in addition to international observers, who should also have an open eye on local militias, the use of remote cameras for monitoring polling stations should be considered. As you know, the Iranian nuclear program is mainly monitored by remote cameras. This should also work for Libyan polling stations. At the very end, I would say, and I'm coming closer to Anas, although I want to repeat, I think that elections are the best way forward for Libya, although it will be quite difficult to get successful ones. So one could ask, why should the elections scheduled for December 21 be more successful than its forerunners if the preconditions are not there? And this means much work needs to be done in Libya and by the international community to make the difference, to convince the Libyans to go to vote, and to make the Libyans understand why this makes sense right now. So elections could lead to a new civil war. They could lead to some more turmoil, but they could also lead to a democratic legitimated government and to a democratically legitimated parliament and to some more stabilization. It's up to the Libyans.
Well, thank you very much, Wolfgang. I mean, the issue of legitimacy of an executive body has always been on the surface, and it's also essential for not only Libyans, but also for the international partners to be able to deal with. So that in itself could be a very important result of an election that would be coming in on December 24th. Jason, I own Libya. Jason has an extensive experience since his postgraduate studies, and he is now an authority on many subjects related to security as well as politics in Libya. Jason, speaking to us from Malta. A few words, Jason, 4 minutes, please.
Great, thanks, Hani, and thanks to Pusztai for putting this event together. It'd be great if other people could mute. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a couple 100 miles north of Tripoli, and I think that puts things in a different perspective here. We've heard many interesting comments about the constitutional basis behind the elections, what was or was not agreed when the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum was initially established, and what are the machinations of the different actors and Trojan horses inside the HOR, inside the LPDF, and maybe failures of UNSMIL to follow through because of changes in leadership or Kubish having COVID last week. Those things are all very interesting to me, but I'd like to present another way of looking at the current impasse that is, I think, complementary to these more tactical approaches. I'd like to zoom out to 30,000 foot and see that in Libya, everything is intertwined. In reality, there are not three separate tracks, a political, a security, and economic track. And Anas was hinting at this and expressing his way of viewing a similar realization. In reality, in Libya, everything is always interlinked. All the tracks at the tactical and strategical levels are the same and are interfacing with each other. So the issue of the CBL audit and CBL reunification, or what's sometimes called the Buznica process, meaning the appointing of new semi-sovereign institutional heads, or what's not been mentioned so far today, but I see as the paramount issue of the budget. And is the HOR going to be able to work with the GNU to have a budget? This is not happening separately from the issues about the elections or the electoral law or constitutional basis or a referendum on the Constitution being done by the HOR and the role of the Higher State Council. All these things are all interlinked in a myriad of ways, and nothing can be solved until everything is solved. And that's why things have fallen apart in Libya previously. Nothing can be solved until everything is solved. So despite this having been the case since the first war of post-Gaddafi succession began in 2014, the international community has not unified its approaches. They still insist on placing things in vertical silos. So they see an economic silo is happening, and as that being the stepsister of a political track, which happens in silo, and then a security track, which happens in another silo. And for whatever reason, I literally cannot grasp the main political actors, be it the US or European Union countries or UNSMIL or the Russians. Well, the Russians in the charts are different, but the main Western political actors really stick to this idea of motivating with praise and with carrots rather than motivating with severe sticks like sanctions and denial of sovereignty. So I would just like to point out the huge mistake of the siloed approach and motivating through positive carrots rather than severe sticks. We're living with the consequences of all of that. And that's the background about the elections. And that's why these debates are happening as they are. So for me, the current situation can be easily explained as follows. The UN mediation process over the last 18 months was actually remarkably successful, but it has been politically focused. It has not had major sticks to motivate spoilers. It has relied on carrots. So the international community was initially focused on getting the PDF to exist as a way to do an end around against Aguila Saleh and go around him as a blocker. Then it was focused on getting the LPDF to commit to elections and to choose candidates for the executive positions. And then as soon as those candidates were chosen, to getting whoever was selected to have their cabinet list approved. And this was largely successful due to Stephanie Williams' persistence and genius. But the other tracks all fell apart and the ball was dropped because, they were just focusing on these silos and they weren't hitting the interconnectedness of the subsidies issue and semi-sovereign institutions' headships, which are actually far more important than elections. So this dovetails with some of the things that Mohamed Eljarh and Anas El Gomati have already said. So we're just back to square one. It's the standard configuration whereby all the status quo players are against any major change happening because they benefit from the economic dysfunctionality of the current system. And the UN, as well as the major Western powers, do not motivate through putting severe penalties on those status quo actors who can be seen to, oh, we're working with you, and they do just enough in the public forum to then be able to block things and insert Trojan horses into the process by oh, if you give us this many deputy ministers, then we'll maybe improve your budget, or we need to have our guys on the LPDF, and then they can say these things or introduce these Trojan horse motions. So in this case, over the last 10 months, the HOR understood that if they bended and played along with the UNSMIL process, they could make sure that nothing ever came from it. So they allowed Dubaiba to come to power while guaranteeing that he'd be weak and could neither pass a budget nor would we get different semi-sovereign institutional heads. And the HOR has just reverted to its role of spoiler and arch status quo player, maybe even making a tacit alliance with Dubaiba, with the governor, behind everyone's back to make sure that just everything is postponed and the can is kicked down the road, with the dinar slightly devalued, but nothing happening on the Buznica process or on, really attacking what matters, which is the dysfunctionality of the Libyan economy and the subsidies. So everyone is, with their head in the trough about the illicit wealth accumulation that the default power players are always able to do. So what does this mean for us? If the budget can be unpicked and Aguila Saleh can be gone around, we can deal with the things that matter, the major headship of the semi-sovereign institutions. Only much, much, much later could elections possibly happen. So if the international community is still going to just focus on these elections, and I've been told behind the back that that's what Kubish cares about, then, we're not going to get any progress. So what I like to say is that when you go into these international conferences, you get people saying things like, you can't undertake economic reform when there's a war going on. But the reality is, of course, the opposite. You can't convene peacemaking conferences or try to hold elections when there are dysfunctional economic incentives at work. So that's where we are. And of course, the LPDF or HOR will never agree to elections unless the economic incentives vis-a-vis subsidies and other matters are not going to just benefit status quo players who want to block. And with that, I kick it back to you, Hani.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, for your perspective on what is happening and the interrelations between the tracks, whether the security, political, economic tracks, and so on. Speaking of all this, we know that there was a report that was released a couple of days ago about the central bank and the need to unify the central bank. Nobody has had the access to it yet, and everybody's curious about it and is very concerned about the possibility that this would fall into the incognito status of the same report that was made about the corruption and the rigging of the elections of the LPDF meeting in Cairo when they chose a new executive body for temporary for Libya. There's a lot of secrecy that's going on, and I understand that many of you have brought up the subject of the leadership of the UN representation in Libya, how they allowed certain points to be exploited and allowed a conversation to be held on an issue that has already been agreed upon. There was also the issue of, yes, we did get stuck with a date, and a date is part of the agreement, that's December 24th, but is this safe? Is this feasible? And is this actually going to produce on December 25th a workable situation, recognizing the major differences? I personally have been in Libya a few months ago, and I've seen an incredible amount of lack of trust, animosity that I've not seen. It almost goes back to the 1949 mistrust between provinces, the demarcation of the historical provinces expressed in social media, in political dialogue, in representation as to any committee or so on. Everything seems to be going back to the demarcation of three provinces, Fezzan, Tripolitania, and Cyrenaica again. The accusations, the nature of the alliances that have been formed with Cyrenaians living in symbiosis with Haftar and the Libyan army. It's an almost a very conflicting aspiration and relation. In Tripoli, the militias that are imposing themselves on not only political decisions, but also how money is being passed on, the budget, where it is going with. I think there are so many complex issues that are making it extremely difficult in the next months to at least have the LPD walk with clear minds as to how do you implement the agreements that you've already made. I won't go to Amal again because she brought up the issue of agreement, and then everything got scuffled in Geneva. And then also her mention of that in the coming days, there will be a committee that will be held to try and reel all the differences back on track and go back to the very basic consensus that was built at the initial agreement. Al, can you indwell on this a little bit?
أعتقد أن المدة القادمة يعني الأيام القادمة سنشهد عمل جاد من لجنة التوافقات. لجنة التوافقات على ما أظن يعني حسب ما انتهينا إليه أن إدخال مشروعات جديدة تناقض الخارطة الطريق وتناقض عمل اللجنة القانونية هذا أمر غير مقبول، وأعتقد أن هذا هو المسار حيكون التركيز على القاعدة القانونية. القاعدة القانونية كانت بها 5 نقاط خلافية، أعتقد أن 4 منها الآن لم تعد خلافية، اللي هي النقاط كانت القسم الدستوري. كان هناك اعتراض كبير من أنصار ديسمبر على القسم القانوني بأهداف فبراير وثورة فبراير. الحقيقة أن هذا الاعتراض في محله، لأن يعني القسم الدستوري يكون للوطن وللشعب ولا يكون لثورة أو لنظام. أعتقد أن النقطة الخلافية هذه أصبحت شبه منتهية، لأن في قبول من جميع الأطراف أن يتم يعني إلغاء القسم على ثورة فبراير. أيضا النقطة الخلافية الأخرى اللي هي هل الانتخابات الرئاسية ستكون مباشرة أو غير مباشرة. الشارع الليبي حسمها تقريبا أن كل الناس تريد أن تكون الانتخابات مباشرة رئاسية وألا تكون يعني من داخل مجلس النواب. أيضا النقطة الثالثة كانت بخصوص الجنسية، هل يصح لمزدوجي الجنسية تولي المناصب السيادية في الدولة كرئيس الوزراء ورئيس الدولة والوزراء. أعتقد أن الخلاف أصبح قاصر على رئيس الدولة فقط، وبدأ يعني الكلام أن يكفي فقط أن يكون عنده الجنسية الليبية، وإذا نجح في الانتخابات يتنازل عن الجنسية الثانية التي يحملها. بالنسبة لرئاسة الوزراء والوزراء أي يعني ممكن أن يستمر بجنسيته الثانية موجودة عنده، فقط من يمثل رأس الدولة اللي هو الرئيس يجب أن يكون لديه الجنسية الليبية فقط. النقطة الرابعة في الخلافيات كانت المكونات اللي هم الأمازيغ والتبو، النسبة العادلة حسب ما يروها من تمثيلهم في كل اللجان وفي كل مناصب الدولة وفي مجلس النواب. يعني أعتقد أن إحنا كان النص عام جاء في الوثيقة اللي هو نسبة تمثيل عادلة، ولكن يبدو لي أنهم يصرون على نسبة تمثيل تكون محددة ب3%. ربما سيتم التوافق بشأن هذه. بقيت نقطة وحيدة فقط، وهي هل يحق للعسكري أن يتقدم للانتخابات ويرشح نفسه؟ طبعا احنا في أثناء العمل خلال لما طلبنا أن نحن ننتخب السلطة التنفيذية، طبعا هي قدمت عبر قوائم. القوائم هذه إحدى القوائم كان بها السيد جويلي، كان يرشح نفسه كرئيس للمجلس الرئاسي، والذي حدث أن لم يتم الاعتراض أو تم الاعتراض على وجود السيد جويلي كرئيس يعني للمجلس الرئاسي ضمن القوائم، ولكن ترشح وانتهى الاعتراض عليه وتم قبوله باعتبار أن نحن لن نقصي أحد والجميع يتقدم، وإذا نجح في الانتخابات وطلع في المجلس الرئاسي يبقى عليه يعني بعد نجاحه أن يتخلى عن وظيفته العسكرية. طبعا حاليا من المتوقع أن يتقدم السيد حفتر للانتخابات، وفي الحالة هذه هو يطالب أو أنصاره يطالبون، يعني غير معروف إذا كان حيتقدم أو لا، ولكن أنصاره يقولون أن كما قبلنا في الملتقى ترشيح السيد جويلي ولم نفرض أن يتنازل عن رتبته العسكرية قبل الترشح، يبقى هذه قاعدة اتخذناها أو سنة يجب أن تسري على الجميع وليس على أحد دون أحد. وبالنسبة لهذه النقطة قد نرى نحن أن الظروف الحالية تقتضي أحيانا التنازل عن بعض القواعد الدستورية في سبيل أن التئام الشمل وفي سبيل قيام الدولة. هذه المسألة ستكون خلافية أمام لجنة التوافقات. إذا ذهبوا إلى ما كان سابقا من قبول السيد جويلي فهم ملزمين أن يسمحوا للعسكري أن يترشح، وإذا فاز يتخلى عن رتبته العسكرية، وإذا لم يفز فرتبته العسكرية باقية لديه كالسابق. هذه هي الخمسة الخلافية التي يعني كانت ضمن القاعدة القانونية والتي ستنظرها لجنة التوافقات. أعتقد أن المسألة الدستور أولا أم الانتخابات أولا. الغضب الذي ساد في الشارع الليبي تجاه هذا الخرق لخارطة الطريق والخرق للقاعدة القانونية التي وضعت أيضا يعني خلال التواصل مع سفراء العديد من الدول، كان واضح الاستياء الكبير من عمل البعثة الجديدة اللي قامت بخرق منهجية العمل وسمحت لمشاريع أخرى بالدخول بعد الانتهاء من هذه المسألة. هذا ما أتوقعه أن ستكون القاعدة القانونية هي التي سيتم عليها التصويت. أيضا لا ننسى أن المفوضية الوطنية للانتخابات السيد عماد السايح ذكر أنه يستحيل خلال هذه الفترة القصيرة أن تكون هناك انتخابات واستفتاء على الدستور في نفس الوقت. فأنا أتوقع خيرا.
شكرا سيدة أمال. بارك الله فيك. Very important points that she brought up. In the coming days, she's anticipating that there will be the meeting of the committee to discuss the 5 points of dispute. One of them is the technicality of when al-qasam, and I can't remember what al-qasam in English is, if somebody can help me. But it is oath. The oath, correct, yes. It is the oath and the technicality of the wording in the oath, and that seems to have been sorted out. There was a question about the, which has been in the streets of the country as well as in the debates in Geneva and others about whether the elections of president will go direct or indirect. And the consensus by most is that they're going to be leading into a direct election of president in Libya. There was an issue of the dual citizenship, and consensus to be building towards that there will be no allowance of a dual citizen to be the president of the country. However, for prime minister and other ministers, including key ministers, they would allow dual citizenship in those categories in there. There was finally the fifth item, which is the representation of minorities. They're debating the percentage that be allowed to be included in representation. The numbers are 3% versus others. That should be solved, according to Amal, in the next few days. And then the last one is, can a military figure put this name on for election? And she states that since there had already been approval of Jouaili, who is a military figure from the West, for representation in the Presidential Council, that that agreement or that understanding should extend itself to allowing Haftar as a military figure to put his name on for elections, with a caveat for both of them that if they are chosen, that they would have to withdraw their position from the military. If not, they can continue in their status as military figures. So those appear in the surface quite easy, but there have been very strong statements that were made in public by key political figures on both sides disputing their willingness to accept the results of an election if this happens. And you have heard statements made by Al-Mishri, for example, that if there is going to be a chance that Haftar, for example, would be elected, that that would be challenged and that would result in disapproval of the results of the elections and the consequences that may actually this leads to. I want to bring in Edward. Edward is on the board of directors of the National Council. He has seen such wrangling extensively in the Balkans. He just came back from Macedonia, where there were some quite interesting debates and discussions on many political issues related to Macedonia relations with EU, its the region, Bulgaria, and so on. Edward, you've been involved so much. You wrote an article on the constitutional debates in Libya and the question of looking and seeking a return to a 1951 model of federal state. And I know this is in many ways not directly involved in the debates that are happening right now, the LPDF and so on. But at one point, and if all this fails, what are the possibilities of sort of a shift in the constitutional discussions to something like this? Do you see that the differences among Libyans are conciliable, inconciliable? What do you see? What is your perspective? And if we can learn from your experience in the Balkan.
Hani, thank you very much. And I tell you, it's really an eye-opener here this morning to listen to all of these highly informed, thoughtful experts giving their perspectives on this tremendously complex situation. And Hani, that's where I would open it up. By comparison to Libya, the Balkans are easy, a walk in the park. This is what I'm hearing this morning here. It's really so dismaying to hear the complexities of the challenge here. And I will tell you, I think that the goal really for this kind of a discussion is to at least try to come to some consensus among the group, if possible, of these esteemed experts, outsiders, and here we have some who are actually participants, to define the problem in Libya. That, to me, seems to be the starting point for all of this, because I'm hearing on this discussion even differences about whether or not elections are the way forward. And Mohamed offered some very compelling arguments against. Others, Wolfgang is saying they should go forward. Jason offers another perspective that says, well, this whole process has become gone off the rails. It's become too siloed. And yet we hear in both Amal and in Zahra, this is to me as an outsider, what's very interesting, is that the parties, as we hear from Amal, seem to be taking this process seriously. So despite all of these other problems and issues, I was really, Hani, based on your translation of what Amal was just saying, is that the parties seem to be taking these details about the oath and these other questions, they seem to be taking them seriously, as if there are serious consequences to them, and instead of just sort of ignoring this process as irrelevant. And to me, that says something. It says that, look, despite all the flaws, and there are many, and the fact that there is no agreed basis, Hani, and obviously the Constitution, going back to the Constitution would be a great way forward, but it does appear, if I'm not mistaken, that there's some sort of forward movement based on this Berlin process, for better or for worse. And it could be one way or the other, but people do, based on what I hear from your translation of Amal, people seem to be taking these otherwise sort of detailed questions, they seem to be taking them seriously. If I'm mistaken on that, then people, I would like to be corrected. But to me, overall, the challenge here is, for this discussion, is people should at least try to define what is the problem in Libya before turning to these various questions about should there be elections, should there not be, how should they be there, should it be on the basis of the going to the Constitution? Is that the problem? And if you ask me to define the problem, and I speak here as in respect of everyone's expertise and as someone who is not a Libya expert, if you ask me as an outsider, what is the problem? I would define it in this word: disorder. That, to me, seems to be the problem in Libya. It's disorder. And the challenge is to find some basis to create order. And that's what the struggle seems to be. And the Stephanie Williams or original UN approach, this Berlin process, is one attempt at finding a portal for order. And it's obviously deeply flawed. And Mohamed pointed out that it was built on in a flawed way with these very serious allegations. But the challenge is compared to what? And if people, for all the criticism of it, every criticism has to be balanced by some alternative, and that's the overarching challenge here, Hani, is to either to work within the confines of this process, which has created a date, again, for better or worse, realistic or completely unrealistic, but it seems to be creating at least a focal point and kind of a forcing event for decisions to take place. And let me quickly turn to Jason's comments, which are quite interesting there. And I understand exactly what Jason is saying, that everything is intertwined. If you look at almost any serious conflict, Afghanistan, for example, that's the case everywhere. The problem is attacking. Where do you begin to attack the problem, addressing the problem when the issues are all intertwined? You can't put all the issues on one table. Ultimately, it's about power. It's about who rules and how is political power, which is ultimately, Jason, I believe, going to decide those questions about economic incentives and those things. Whoever is the ruler is the one who will be deciding those economic questions. And that's why ultimately political power is everything. And even the military power is in the aim of achieving that goal of being the rule maker, the decider on those questions. So that's my suggestion for the group is to try to define the problem, and where there are not satisfaction with the current approach, then to create alternatives. And Hani, I'll close quickly just by saying something about what I would perceive to be the US perspective on all this. Is, again, imagine you're some senior official and you were watching this and you were hearing all these disparate viewpoints. You would not be terribly encouraged or enthused about getting involved in this. It appears to be so complex. Even here, these experts do not agree among themselves about even the overarching goal of even having elections, whether or not that's even appropriate or the basis for that. So sure. That is, Hani, I think a real concern is that there's just not going to be a lot of enthusiasm about it. It's very complex. US interests, again, in the end, the main concern is about terrorism. And I just don't think there's going to be a big appetite to wade into this too deeply.
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
It's very interesting to hear the enthusiasm that you're proposing would be in the U.S. circuits vis-a-vis Libya. And it's interesting to put this also within the context of a larger image of the status of the United States in the region, particularly in view of a policy of withdrawal from Afghanistan, thinking about how you unwind your status in Iraq, the changes in alliances and so on in the Gulf region, and how things are shifted in relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and United Arab Emirates and so on. The sense that the United States is less and less interested in long-term commitments, owning, and particularly, certainly the United States, I'm pretty sure, is not interested in owning a nightmare in Libya if things would go wrong after the elections of December 24th. I hear Mohamed Eljarh's comment about the belief that the 24th of December was a date, and you had to put a date, and there was an agreement on a date, but it is in many ways an expedited date, and there are so much wrangling and disagreements on the morning after what the country is going to be looking at, what constitutional rules are going to be, even on a temporary basis, taking as means of running the country until serious constitutional discussions are made and reiterations are made, and how you fit it into the divide that exists in Libya today between provinces, between leaders, between political views and orientations, Islamists, Jamahiriya, New Vision Youth, and so on. I think the issues are so complex, as you mentioned, Edward. I want to just get back to, again, to Wolfgang, because we have not touched upon the security situation in more detail and how that impacts the elections, how it impacts the ability to conduct proper elections. You brought in the issue of cameras and so on. Those are technicalities, but the truth is, are both sides with the kind of a crater that exists at the search point between two entrenched armies, and opinions are extremely different, and all gaze towards getting some gains from those elections in December 24th. And if they don't get what they want, if for some reason the elections are done in a non-conciliatory way and produces a product that is not satisfactory to one and another. You mentioned very briefly a risk of war. I don't know if it was you or Mohamed Eljarh, but can you very quickly comment on this? And I want to, after that, have each one of the panelists make a final comment about elections December 24th. Will they happen or not? December 25th, what will the country look like? So Wolfgang, we're going to start with you very quickly. We have 10 minutes.
I need to stress again that the participation is really key for the success. If there is a limited participation in the elections, it will be easier for the various armed groups to recheck the outcome. The more people are participating and the less election fraud takes place, the more the outcome has a chance to get accepted. With regard to the various forces in Libya, the Russians, the Turks, the various mercenaries, I don't think that it is realistic to get them out of the country before the elections if they take place in December. There is simply no way or no reason why they should do so. The Turks are there because they believe that they are invited by the government of National Accord, by the previous government, and they are there because they are seeking to consolidate their gains. They are there because they are the backbone of any kind of eventual military solution. So as long as the Turks are in the country, there is still a chance that the Libyan army or Operation Volcano, call them whatever you want, have a chance to occupy the oil crescent by military means. And this is exactly the reason why the Russians won't depart, because the Russians are there to prevent this as some kind of tripwire and to give the Egyptians some time to intervene in the case there would be such an offensive. And they would not rule this out if the situation is going from bad to worse. We must remember that those who are currently in charge, the House of Representatives, the High Council of State, and the GNU, they have demonstrated in a very impressive way that they can't fix the country. They can't fix the economy, they can't fix the security, and they can't fix the political situation. So if those will continue, discontent will increase, and this makes a renewed major violence more likely during the next year or maybe a little bit later.
So quickly, Wolfgang, December 25th elections, will it happen or not?
I think they will be postponed for the time being and then called off.
Very good. Thank you. So the December 25th will be postponed.
Very bad.
All right. Yes, I understand that. Okay, Zahra, please come in and give us your opinion. I know that I cited you a little bit. Apologize.
Yeah, it's okay. So well, most of us here acknowledge that the problem is much more complex than the solutions proposed. And it needs a more comprehensive, nuanced approach, and that we wanted to transcend the silos, link the economic with the security, with the political. But then, at the end of the day, we do have a serious, urgent problem. We need to renew political legitimacy. We do have a problem that is somehow it's not, it needs a fix, and the fix is through elections. The problem is what I'm hearing now is that it's either you have a rigged elections where you allow military figures to run without resigning, setting a precedent in the whole world. And I don't think that what we had before is a precedent, but because it was never part of our constitutional declaration. So I think insisting to have either rigged elections by allowing military figures to run is very explosive, and the attempt is basically to explode the whole electoral process and to abort it. I don't think Libyans want warlord democracy. I think they want elections, and they want elections for both. Because if you ask about my anticipation, I think we will have elections, but definitely we were going to have only parliamentary elections. If we're going to have only parliamentary elections, we will not help Libyans solve their problems, because again, the next parliament will be the same parliament as this one, and oligarchs will continue capturing the state. Libya needs an executive body that is elected by Libyans, by respecting human rights and rule of law, not by allowing military figures to run, not by allowing war criminals to run. We deserve to have an elected executive body as well as an elected executive legislative body. But if we continue in this, like the last decade, that means we'll have a parliament that is corrupt, a parliament that will continue to blackmail the executive body. And most importantly, it means that this is what they're not saying, this is the deals that are happening at the moment, actually, is that this executive body, namely the GNU, will continue in power for the last 5 years. And we know how this government came. It came by a corrupt way, and we know their deals. So I don't think any extension to this government will be helpful for Libya. Libya needs an elected executive body as well as an elected legislative body.
Thank you so much, Zahra. Jason Pack, you have 2 minutes. Please make your comment. The question is, will the December 24th happen on time? And what does Libya look like December 25th?
Thanks, Hani. I agree with Wolfgang. Of course, the election isn't going to happen on December 24th. It never was going to, even during the LPDF process or when Abdelhamid came into power. But I go one step further and say that even if it did happen, that wouldn't solve anything, because the real Libya issues are about the relationship of the central bank to the government. And that's why I think what you said, Edward, was a very excellent problematizing of matters in the way a graduate supervisor would. Oh, let's get to the questions, let's problematize those questions. But then I think you misunderstood me, because Libya is not like another conflict. In Syria or in Yemen, they're fighting over a political issue, but not in Libya. It's not about territorial control. That's absolutely irrelevant. In Libya, what matters is the relationship of the central bank to the budget, to subsidies. And that's not what the Syria conflict is being fought about. So Zahra made some very interesting points about the importance of the oligarchs who have gotten into the process and they just want to stay in power. So what we need is an international community committed not to getting mercenaries out or to holding elections, but to fundamentally reforming the Libyan economy and dealing with the relationship of semi-sovereign institutions to power. And no election is going to fix that, because you'll get another government that comes into power just like the GNU, and they can't pass a budget or they can't control how the central bank behaves. So to end on Edward's note, we need to have the right questions, which neither the players nor the international mediators have had. Otherwise, of course, we're not going to have the right solutions. Sorry for that depressing comment, but that's been my views for many years now.
Thank you. That doesn't look good for after elections, December 24th. Anas El Gomati, please, 2 minutes. Will December 24th elections happen? And what will the country look like December 25th? Is it going to be workable?
Yeah, I think there are two scenarios. It's either extended by 6 to 12 months as a result of the negotiations that Amal and Zahra pointed out, or that it does take place on the 24th of December, but I don't think it solves Libya's problem. Libya's problem has never been solely about legitimacy. It's also been about subservience. And I think this is one of the things that we find has the real kind of source of the conflict behind it. And that's really where we have to start, framing this question accurately. And that's where I think, again, legitimacy, we've seen that before. In 2012, the GNC rammed the idea that it had international legitimacy down everyone's throats. The NTC before it, the House of Representatives before it. Legitimacy is not a proxy for legality. And it certainly shouldn't be used in that sense. I mean, the idea that any of these parties or bodies can run away with elected legitimacy for 5 years or 10 years or however long is not really going to answer the grievances or the desires of many of the Libyans there at the heart. And also, when any kind of government comes into power, the true question, again, be it this new GNU as an acid test for how it governs, it cannot govern because of the centers of power that have been there for 7 years. Whether it's directly because they're not given landing permits by the Libyan Arab Armed Forces to dock in Benghazi, or whether it's indirectly because they've had their budget suffocated by the House of Representatives, a member of which spoke this week and said, let's get to the heart of this issue. It's about power. It's about how much you, as Jason has mentioned, about economic issues, whether or not you're going to empower us economically, or whether or not you're going to give us the kind of relationship we want with political authority at the Ministry of Defense level or at the presidential level. These are the kind of issues that I think, if we kick down the road, elections and legitimacy solve nothing. The idea of legitimacy is that Libyans will respect, or Libyan civilians may come to respect that legitimacy, but if the very actors that we talk about who claim to be the antidote to this issue, but have really been the venom for the last 7 or 8 years, are not going to respect that authority and will come through the back door as they have for the last 7 years, we have not solved anything. I mean, the real case should be here is, what are you hoping that elections solve in a tangible way? And if we can answer that question, then we can begin to move forward. I think it's really getting at the heart of that. Thanks, Hani.
Thank you, Anas. I'm going to ask very quickly, Leila, and I know you're very, Amal, you're very bought into the process going towards the 24th of December. So حنسألك مرة ثانية هل تعتقدي بأن في ملخص دقيقتين الانتخابات حتتم يوم 24 ديسمبر، وما هو شكل الشارع الليبي والسلطة التنفيذية، وكيف ستكون شكل الدولة يوم 25 ديسمبر؟ هل حتشتغل will it be functional ولا حتكون معلقة بصعوبات؟ سيدة آمال تفضل.
أنا أؤمن أن 24 ديسمبر أصبح موعد لا رجوع عنه عندما أرى كل هذه التجمعات وكل هذه الكيانات السياسية في الداخل تنادي وتسعى وتجهز نفسها ل 24 ديسمبر. أنا على يقين أنه سيكون يوم انتخابات في ليبيا. ما الذي سيحدث يوم 25 ديسمبر؟ أنا أعتقد إذا بدأنا فعلا في إقرار الانتخابات والذهاب نحوها سيكون من المهم جدا العمل على اللجنة العشرة العسكرية، تقوية دورها، مساعدتها عبر المجتمع الدولي، وهذا ما طلبناه من الجهات الدولية التي تتواصل معنا. لا بد من تقوية دور لجنة العشرة العسكري، وأيضا تقوية الداخلية الليبية الموحدة، لأن حتى الآن لم يتم توحيد السلطة التنفيذية لوزارة الداخلية، لازال بها انقسام كبير. لا بد من العمل من الآن وحتى 24 ديسمبر على توحيد الداخلية اللي هي الشرطة وغيرها، وأيضا العمل على لجنة 5+5 تقويتها بالتعاون مع المجتمع الدولي. أعتقد يوم 25 ديسمبر ستستمر هذه السلطة التنفيذية الموجودة حاليا كسلطة تسيير أعمال إلى حين يتم تشكيل السلطة التنفيذية جديدة والحكومة جديدة من البرلمان. أنا على يقين أن 24 ديسمبر قادم والانتخابات قادمة.
شكرا.
وبالتأكيد أريد أن أضيف نقطة. بالتأكيد كلنا نعرف أن صندوق الانتخابات هو وسيلة سلمية لفض المنازعات، قد لا يأتيك بالكفاءات المطلوبة ولكنه بالتأكيد حل سلمي للنزاع. هذا هو المطلوب فقط.
شكرا لك سيدة أمال. So in brief, and to try and give justice to what she strongly believes that the election will happen on the 24th. And that the 25th, there will be a maintenance of the current government on a temporary basis until it hands over to the new executive. He is emphasizing the importance of strengthening the 5+5 group and give the power to be able to conduct its security at the level of the police and other kind of municipality levels and so forth. She emphasizes the importance for the international community and other factors to work with the group of 10, the 5+5, to strengthen the role of security as we move on towards elections and after that. Thank you, Amal. Mohamed Eljarh, you have the last word in here. You have 2 minutes. Will the elections happen 24th of December? And what will the country look like 25th of December?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hani. Let me first clarify something. I think there has been a misunderstanding in the position that I was presenting. Of course, there are challenges to the elections, but my point is that we have an agreement and we have UN Security Council resolutions endorsing that agreement. And we should work to uphold that agreement and all the provisions of that agreement, including the 24th of December date. And we should not, under any circumstance, allow spoilers or status quo forces to remain in power beyond that date. Data that has been published by USAID and the United States Embassy and data that is not published shows overwhelming support amongst the public for elections in Libya, especially for direct presidential elections in Libya. So it's important to understand that elections should happen on the 24th of December to address the issue of Libyans choosing who their leaders are, to embark on a state building project and a nation building project that previous elected authorities have failed to do. Now, what needs to be done? I think the questions that we should be asking, what needs to be done in order to ensure that elections take place on 24th of December? what needs to be done to ensure that we do have a good result on the 25th of December. That includes more work on the 5+5 military committee, implementing the provisions of the ceasefire that was agreed in Geneva, including the unified force that has not until now been formed. A lot of work, international pressure and Libyan pressure should be put towards that. The other issue is that there should be a national peace conference in Libya this month or next month, maybe under the auspices of the Presidential Council, to include that political and social stakeholders come together and agree on a very basic principle, accepting the results of a free and fair election.
So, Mohammed, having said all this, do you think the elections will happen on the 24th of December? And what is the country going to be look like on the 25th?
I would like to see the elections happen, and I understand the amount of challenges that continue to exist. Unfortunately, I think currently the way we have seen Geneva going and the way that we see Libyan stakeholders going, it looks like they're going to prevent elections from taking place on 24th of December, and the result will be a serious and severe legitimacy crisis that is going to trigger yet another round of conflict and entrench foreign interference in Libya and lead to Libya being split again between two governments that are not elected by the Libyan people and that are monopolized by families, in this case, Dbeiba in the west and Haftar in the east.
Thank you so much. Very, very stimulating conversation. Excellent comments and opinions. I want to thank everyone on this panel for their contribution today. And we hope that we see a productive, effective election if at all this would happen. But we have our hands on our hearts and hope that things will go well for the Libyan people. Thank you again, all of you, for the participation on this wonderful panel. Thank you again. We adjourn now.